Hello and welcome to the Leading Edge webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Organizational Leadership program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Lawrence Ko on Becoming Singaporean, Lee Kuan Yew's vision of multiracial national identity. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Leading Edge playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I'll turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Francis Wu, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Organizational Leadership program.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where in the world you are. First, I would like to share a few words about the sponsoring institution and program for today's event. As the first research institution in the United States, Johns Hopkins University exemplifies the pursuit of truth and the sharing of knowledge with the world. The Johns Hopkins Masters of Science in Organizational Leadership program cultivates graduates who become change agents in local and global communities through scholarship and praxis. Our students strive to master the ability to empower people and transform societies by leadership development through studies in both humanities and the sciences. I welcome you to learn more about our program. Now, it is my honor to introduce to you today's speaker, Mr. Lawrence Ko, founder and director of Asian Journeys, a Singapore-based social enterprise devoted to Asian cultural research and leadership development. Lawrence is also an author and associate trainer in Singapore Civil Service College. Let's welcome Mr. Lawrence Ko.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Peter. Greetings from Singapore, with the sun just rising this morning here. And what a privilege it is to be part of this platform to share with the Johns Hopkins community on this topic that is very close to my heart. I've entitled my talk, Becoming Singaporean, as a way of looking at Lee Kuan Yew's vision of multiracialism in Singapore in forging the national identity. And I speak as a citizen of Singapore, especially in my own individual capacity. Well, have you heard of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew? The next slide. As you know, Lee Kuan Yew is the founding father of independent Singapore, and he is highly respected by world leaders of his generation. He became the first Prime Minister of Singapore when he won the elections for the internal self-government under the British rule in 1959. And when Singapore became independent, fully independent in 1965, Lee Kuan Yew became the first Prime Minister of Singapore. But in 1990, November, he stepped aside and enabled his deputy, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, to become the next Prime Minister. And then he became the senior minister in the cabinet, ensuring a successful, planned succession process in Singapore's leadership transition. So he has generally been recognized to be the leader who has led Singapore as a new nation from a third world economy to the first. And that's indicated by the title of his memoir, which was published in the year 2000. Before we look at Lee Kuan Yew's vision of multiracialism, allow me to share a few highlights, brief highlights about Singapore. The next slide, you see that Singapore is a city-state. It's a country with a population of 6 million living on an island of around 700 square kilometers. So there will be approximately about 250 square miles. And it's one of the few city-states in the world. If you've watched the Hollywood movie Crazy Rich Asians, you would have seen the skyline of the city as the story was set in the context of Singapore with the famous Merlion, as you can see in this slide, in this picture, and the Marina Bay as our cityscape. Singapore is recognized as a rich country and is now one of the most expensive places to live in the world. Well, some of you older friends from America would have heard of Singapore, perhaps from an incident way back in 1994, where an American youth was charged here for vandalism, and he was punished according to the Singapore laws with caning on the buttocks. The then President Clinton intervened and got the caning reduced from 6 strokes to 4. The news got a bit of media attention in the States. Yeah. And that is to say that Singapore is actually well known for being a clean and green city. There's also, it has been said with a sense of humor, that Singapore is a fine city because of the hefty fines imposed on littering, spitting in the streets, with bans on chewing gum and smoking in public places. These legislation are still in place and enforced in order to make the city a well-managed and livable city despite it being in the tropics. And the next slide, you find that we have this Singapore brand, which is associated with Lee Kuan Yew. Singapore has a per capita GDP of over US $70,000 and boasts of being a global metropolis and a key financial center in Asia, with one of the busiest container ports in the world. So Singapore is a good brand name, and the passport is well sought after because it grants visa-free access to 100 countries. And that's something greatly appreciated by the Singapore citizens. And it is acknowledged that Lee Kuan Yew is largely responsible for building the Singapore brand name and associated especially with the Singapore Airlines and the Changi International Airport, if you've been here before. And we welcome you to Singapore, definitely. The next slide shows that in 2015, actually, Lee Kuan Yew passed away at the age of 91, and he's mourned and missed by many Singaporeans. That was also the year of our Golden Jubilee, and as part of the SG50 celebrations, as we call it, I was privileged to put together a book entitled Ethnic Rhythms, Life in the Global City. And in this book, we celebrate the diversity of ethnicities and the multiplicity of cultures we have in Singapore. The different races and cultures march to the rhythms and drum beats they hear, which are exciting. And against the backdrop of 911 and terror threats, however, such diversity can pose immense challenges. But nevertheless, there are tremendous opportunities to study and celebrate cultural diversity in Singapore. In this talk, I will highlight 3 traits of Lee Kuan Yew, or LKY, as he's affectionately called, in his leadership in forging a multiracial national identity, namely his historical consciousness, his cultural competency, and his strategic vision and alignment. The next slide, please. Firstly, being Singapore, and this is about LKY's historical consciousness. Lee Kuan Yew is an astute student of history with a great sense of historical consciousness. LKY has once said, if you do not know history, you think short-term. But if you know history, you think medium or long-term. Only those who study history and understands history can effectively participate in history and help change history. And he said, to understand the present and anticipate the future, one must know enough of the past, enough to know a sense of the history of the people. So in that sense, Lee Kuan Yew was one of such men with historical consciousness, and indeed he was a history maker. Born as a British subject in Singapore, he aspired to be educated in Britain. His dream, however, was dashed when the British surrendered to the Japanese troops cycling into Singapore from Peninsular Malaysia. He survived the Japanese atrocities during the World War II and escaped execution by the Japanese by the skin of the teeth. Hence, he was convinced that Singapore cannot leave its destiny to outsiders. The Japanese occupation was a watershed not only in the history of Singapore, but also in his life. and it gave him the conviction to want to see Singapore out of British colonialism. And this was strengthened in the post-war period, especially during his days when he was studying law in Cambridge University, and where he was able to make friends with key figures who would go on to rule England, including the later on Prime Minister Harold Wilson. And Lee Kuan Yew was convinced through his interaction with the British that he was able to stand up to the Brits. And with his like-minded colleagues, Lee Kuan Yew returned to Singapore and formed the People Action Party, and they went on to win the 1959 General Assembly elections and became one of the youngest prime ministers at the age of 36. And he understood that to gain independence from the British colonial rule, he needed to earn the trust of the British. But he also realized that a merger with the Federation of Malaya would accelerate the process. So he worked the ground to win the masses in Singapore to this vision of the merger with Malaysia through a referendum in 1962. Because the masses were predominantly Chinese, about 75% Chinese, and he needed to mobilize the Chinese ground to win the referendum. He astutely collaborated with the Communist Party of Malaya, which was then very actively working the Singapore Chinese majority ground. This episode in his political life was known as riding the communist tiger in order to achieve his purpose of getting a referendum, which he did. But Singapore's merger with the newly constituted Federation of Malaysia in September 1963 was short-lived. The Malaysian political leaders at that time were dominated by the Malays, who felt threatened by LKY's call for a Malaysian Malaysia rather than a Malay Malaysia. You see, at that time, Malaysia was dominated by Malay rulers, and they were convinced that only Malays should rule Malaysia. The minorities like the Chinese and Indians were considered the lower class or second-class citizens. This vision of the Malaysian Malaysia was actually the genesis of Lee Kuan Yew's multiracial vision for not only Malaysia, but also Singapore. And at that time, racial riots were rife with communal politics in Malaysia. And by August 1965, Singapore was kicked out of the Federation to stem the growing unhappiness with Lee Kuan Yew's attempt to grow his vision of multiracialism within Malaysia. And on August 9, 1965, Lee Kuan Yew went on national television in Singapore to announce the separation of Singapore from Malaysia. However, it was not like a euphoric leader making an announcement of a newly independent country, making a triumphant declaration of independence, even though that was what he had worked for. On the contrary, Lee Kuan Yew on national television was choked with emotions, holding back tears as he tried to explain the existential challenge of the political situation. It became known famously as his moment of anguish. This moment of anguish reflected Lee Kuan Yew's historical awareness that newly independent Singapore was quite untenable, fraught with social, economic, political, and military challenges. Yes, Singapore had a natural deep water harbor and has enjoyed being a free trade emporium and a thriving port city along important trade routes and sea lanes over the last 150 years. But that was only because there was the Malaya hinterland with the agricultural produce and with tin and rubber to export. But now with Malaysia closing the hinterland, the question is, will Singapore as a port city survive? The new nation has no natural resources. Even the bulk of drinking water has to be bought from Malaysia, with a water agreement lasting till 2061. The next slide. So in other words, Singapore was actually a little red dot. This was a famous title given by the Indonesian president in 1998, which was a derogatory remark. But Singapore is indeed a mere tiny little red dot, even in a map of Southeast Asia. The only resources that Singapore had were the human resources, and that comprised of many different races and religions living in segregated communities. So can these diverse communities, which had just recently been embroiled in racial riots, be formed into a new nation with a new national identity? And will the new neighbors of Malaysia and Indonesia, which had viewed Singapore as predominantly a Chinese majority society, as a third China, will it be a threat to the Malay archipelago? And will they seek to fan the flames of ethnic tension and conflicts to unsettle newly formed Singapore to their advantage? So within 2 years of its independence, also, the British announced that they will pull out its troops east of the Suez Canal, and Singapore will be without British military cover by 1971. So these were the real challenges that faced Singapore at that time. So in that sense, Singapore was really an accidental nation, unplanned birth and unexpected to survive. But with Lee Kuan Yew's keen understanding of the historical development and geopolitical implications, he assembled a team of leaders who will form the basis of the future diplomatic corps, the future defense force, and the economic development board. So Singapore was able quickly to establish international recognition for its sovereignty as an independent state and form alliances and forge military pacts to protect herself from immediate threats. And the Singapore Armed Forces was formed, interestingly, with the help of Israeli commanders and instructors fresh from the Six-Day War in 1967. And because of the sensitivity of the neighboring Muslim states, Singapore had to hide the identity of these early Israeli trainers because Singapore did not want to be conceived as a second Israel surrounded by Muslim states, especially in the wake of the Six-Day War, because it would have heightened tension with the neighbors. But more importantly, Singapore went on to attract foreign investments to grow the economy and to create jobs for the people. And this was done by very quickly wooing the American multinationals, which were on the rise globally, to set up factories in Singapore with tax incentives so that they can provide skills development for Singapore. And because Japan at that time was also rising rapidly, thanks to the post-war reconstruction efforts with American aid, Singapore was also actively bringing in Japanese companies to help create jobs and bring in technology transfer. And in that sense, Lee Kuan Yew chose to forget the atrocities committed during the Japanese occupation, which he himself experienced. So these were just examples of Lee Kuan Yew's ability to discern the times, to know the historical givenness in history, and how to ride the waves and trends to help shape the story of Singapore. And Singapore seeks to play to its strength as a little red dot, a small city-state, nimble and adaptive to historical changes. Right. Secondly, the next slide, becoming Singaporean. This is about LKY's cultural competency. Lee Kuan Yew's cultural competency is key to managing the fragile social fabric of Singapore society. And as a new nation, he put forward a vision of a Singaporean Singapore. Singapore's population at that time was about 2 million, with a majority of Chinese at 77%, Malays at 14%, and Indians at 7%. This has been the demographic balance for nearly a century, and Lee Kuan Yew wanted to keep the balance for economic reasons. Though the Chinese were in the majority, he did not want Singapore to become perceived as a Chinese society. Neither will the Malays be given special rights just because they were original settlers. He advocated a 4M social policy, namely multiracial, multicultural, multireligious, and multilingual society. He instituted English language as a lingua franca, the language of instruction in schools and in the marketplace. And out of sensitivity to the geopolitical situation at that time, being a Malay-dominated region, Malay language was recognized as our national language. and special provisions were made in the legislation and the constitution to protect and provide Malay privileges. But this was not tantamount to affirmative action of any sorts. Lee stated the importance of equal rights for all races, and this is reflected in this policy of meritocracy that will be the basis for social mobility and success, not race. Lee Kuan Yew's cultural competency was evident in his ability to not only master the English language well, but also the Malay and Chinese languages. As a Peranakan Streets-born Chinese growing up in a well-to-do family which spoke primarily English and a little colloquial Malay, Lee Kuan Yew went on to embark on learning the Chinese languages, firstly of Mandarin, because he wanted to connect to the Chinese ground. However, he later found out that the Chinese majority, actually not many really understood Mandarin, you see, only about 20%, because the majority spoke Hokkien, which is a dialect from Fujian province. So he also learned Hokkien in order to address and mobilize the Chinese masses. And his annual National Day rally speeches were always given in Malay, Chinese, and English languages. And is a practice that is still carried on until today with all the subsequent prime ministers. Beyond learning languages, LKY understood that through language, one can understand the core of the various ethnic cultures and therefore the depth of the cultural characteristics of the different people. So to forge a disparate community with different ethnicities into a nation, it is important to foster a national identity which will transcend ethnic, religious, and race and categories here. The next slide. You find that the Lee Kuan Yew's government played a dominant role in managing social cohesion in Singapore. This is an example of a very strong state interventionist or developmentalist approach, using social engineering to help create and imagine a new national identity. And these vehicles included the use of schools, where schools in Singapore were nationalized then, and the new national anthem, the national flag was being raised every day, and the new national pledge, which was composed in 1966, would be recited in schools every morning by all the students in school. And schools will therefore be a crucial place for enculturating the next generation and to create a new shared experience as a Singapore citizen. The National Service is also another vehicle for social integration, because this is the compulsory conscription of male citizens into the military service or the civil defense or police force for 2 years. And this becomes another social arena where young men from all walks of life and different backgrounds and races and classes will come together, live and train in a shared military or NS experience and serve later on in the reserves for the next 20 years. National Day parades and pageantry with lots of flag waving participants and many rehearsals was also another way to create a sense of belonging and national pride, if not patriotism. It is like the daily flag raising ceremonies in school writ large, and it's played out, these National Day parades are played out like a religious liturgy, reenacting the national historical narrative, affirming a sense of a shared experience to make citizens feel proud and to get them to pledge allegiance to the nation. So Lee Kuan Yew understood the powerful social cultural worldviews embedded in this use of ethnic consciousness to build national identity. Although in the early years of nation building, ethnic consciousness was de-emphasized in favor of national identity, however, Lee recognized that the deep sense of value and kinship in each of these ethnic culture and groups were very strong, and Singapore never tried to assimilate different races and cultures into a melting pot. Instead, it's like presenting a plate of Singapore laksa, if some of you have heard of that. It's a local fruit salad dish, if you wish. So though in the same plate, the different fruits continue to maintain its distinctive smell, texture, and flavor, although mixed in a special laksa prawn paste. The next slide, please. You'll find that Singapore is actually more like a tropical fruit stall with many tropical fruits on display, especially during the Mid-Autumn Festival. And it shows the varied colors and shapes and smells of the abundant harvest. So in Singapore, the fruit analogy has been also used to forge national identity. Lee Kuan Yew once said that we are not to be like an orange, easily squashed and squeezed dry by others. Rather, we are to be like the durian, that's the thorny fruit in the picture in the slide, the favorite king of fruits in Singapore. It has a hard, thorny shell and a pungent smell, and it's not easily overcome. But within it, once it's open, you can enjoy the lovely, creamy, soft flesh, which is high in protein and very nutritious. So ethnic consciousness and cultural communities are also emphasized by Lee Kuan Yew because he realized that deep social issues are best addressed through persuasion by fellow kinsmen rather than by outsiders, including the government. Hence, in 1980s, 20 years after the nation was born, he began to emphasize the importance of self-help clan associations and to provide greater sense of homogeneity within the different ethnic groups and to promote intra-ethnic harmony so that they can encourage education and economic progress within each ethnic group. And later on, Lee Kuan Yew is also known to be a champion of Asian values. Right. Thirdly, the next slide. Lee Kuan Yew is also one with strategic vision and alignment. Lee Kuan Yew's ability to create a Singapore national identity must be attributed to his strategic vision and alignment. Because way back in the early 70s, he realized that we have lost an economic hinterland, and he envisaged Singapore then to become a global city, serving not only the immediate hinterland, but the entire region of Southeast Asia and then Asia, but eventually the whole world. And this was way before even the academic discourse on global city was even emerging. His positioning Singapore as a global city inspired vision and hope in the people of Singapore, because the nation then embarked on the road to modernity and globalization. He persuaded the people that dislocation from the old ways of life and relocation to new ways of life was inevitable and good for both the individual and the nation. So the old rural and farming communities, we call it the kampongs here, made way for new housing estates as public housing was provided by the government, where each family can become proud home owners. Today, over 80% of the citizens live in their HDB homes, and they live in housing estates where each neighborhood reflects the national social demographics because there are ethnic quotas for each housing estate. So in other words, the neighborhood cannot become an ethnic enclave whereby it becomes an entirely Malay or Indian or Chinese housing estate. It must have a good flow of this ethnic heterogeneity. It was yet another way of social engineering as families learn to live next door to neighbors who are racially and culturally different from them. This strategic vision of Lee Kuan Yew is perhaps seen best in the Singapore River cleanup, which is the next slide, because this is a classic example where we can see LKY, with his political vision and his ability to bring everyone together on a common national project. You see, in 1977, Lee Kuan Yew announced that the black, filthy, and smelly Singapore River needs to be cleaned up, and that in 10 years, he wants to see it done. So he immediately had the government create the first interministerial task force and brought them together, working with government agencies and local businesses to address the many complicated and multifaceted issues that will impact housing, business, and livelihood issues in order to get the Singapore River cleanup. And by 1987, 10 years after the project was announced, the Singapore River was indeed cleaned up. and it was now home to powerboat races, quayside restaurants, and tourist spots. So later on, the Singapore River mouth was enlarged to contain the Marina Bay and the Marina Barrage and the present Singapore skyline that we enjoy. So the success of the Clean River project demonstrated the political vision of Lee Kuan Yew, and more importantly, the political will of Lee Kuan Yew and his government, where he can bring and align disparate segments of the society together to accomplish great feats and achieve stated vision and goals. And this certainly helped the different communities in Singapore to trust his political leadership and to buy into the grand vision of the Singapore brand and national identity. So in short, let me summarize in the next slide. What are the lessons we can learn from Lee Kuan Yew's leadership in terms of building a multiracial Singapore? Perhaps these are the three quick areas: his historical consciousness, understanding the historical givenness and of a place, and to embrace a sense of destiny together. Secondly, to have the cultural competency to be able to develop, understand and develop the ethnic values, especially Asian values. And thirdly, his strategic vision and alignment to be able to build economic dynamism in a new nation. Right. In conclusion, the next slide. The national identity of Singapore, is it real or imagined? Is it sustainable? Can the experience of nation building of Singapore be replicated as a formula for a new nation or community elsewhere? Lee Kuan Yew will be the first to say that Singapore is both a miracle and a freak of history. As I mentioned, it's been said that Singapore is an accidental nation. It happened because of the historical circumstances and milieu of that time, and because of that, there were leaders and a pioneer generation who caught a vision and were willing to pay with their lives to forge a new shared experience as a new nation. So can the new immigrants and even new generation of Singaporean citizens truly become Singaporean? Lee Kuan Yew would welcome and encourage all who would come and join us and fight with us, as he said, because Singapore as a global city will continue to need immigrants and global talents. But he would also concede that becoming truly a nation would take another 100 years, because it takes time to help people grow deeper roots and develop shared experiences while encouraging them to go and aspire to great ambitions and to go right the rainbow. Right. So this is the presentation. I'll just end it here and welcome some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Such a rich analysis and insightful discussion, insightful presentation. I really appreciate it. Audience, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section, and I will share those with Lawrence. So Lawrence, I have so many questions, but I will start with an observation based on the insights that you shared. I was able to see Lee Kuan Yew, this effective and respected leader, in his humanity. You shared that he shed tears at this moment of really triumph, but he was so concerned about the future of the country. He seemed to be able to meet people where they were. He created this very thoughtful succession plan when the natural tendency is to hold on to power, right? And so this humanity in him, where do you think that deep sense of humanity came from?
I think, as he has famously said, thank you, Francis, for this comment and question. I think, as he famously said, he says that it takes troubled times and historical challenges and historically challenging situations to mold great characters and great leaders. And I think his life was a good example of that. As we mentioned, he actually his generation lived through the period of the Second World War, the Japanese occupation with all the atrocities, and then the difficult times of post-war in rebuilding, reconstruction of society, and with decolonizations and independent movements. So I think he was a good example of somebody who has lived through tumultuous times, and that, in short, helped to build character, as he would emphasize. And I think there's an example of how he intentionally also tried to understand people in their situations, in their ethnic, cultural situations. So I think perhaps that would have attributed to his sense of humanity, which you pointed out so well.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. So in your estimation, he attributed this quality to the time that he was in.
Yes. Yeah.
And that reminds me of this saying, or this perpetual debate. Is it times make heroes, or heroes make times, right? And so
Yes.
I think both can be true. And the story of his leadership is really inspiring. So I have, I guess, another observation. You shared with us about the effort that he took to learn Mandarin, only to find out that only 3% of the population would speak it. But then he went on to learn Hokkien. So it reminds me of something Nelson Mandela said, which is, and I paraphrase, if you speak a language someone understands, it goes into his or her head. But if you speak their native tongue, it goes into their heart, right? So I think as leaders, if we pay close attention to followers' cultural heritage and their backgrounds, their surroundings, where they're coming from, and that really makes a huge difference. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that aspect. I see a question that Peter raised. It seems like some leaders try to create national unity by banning different ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds. Yet Lee Kuan Yew was able to create a national identity by embracing the differences. Was this a political necessity, or did this reflect his greater understanding of the region?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a very interesting mix of using different ethnicities and different religions and languages and all that to help forge a national identity. Actually, if you look at the history of Singapore over 60 years now, next year we would celebrate 60 years. You find that in the first 10 to 20 years, actually ethnic consciousness was de-emphasized as Singapore was trying to build a national identity, what we call the Singaporean-ness, Singaporean Singapore, right? So we don't want to make it a Chinese or Malay town. We want to make it a Singaporean place. So in that sense, initially, ethnic consciousness was kind of de-emphasized. But later on in the 80s, I think when there's already a beginning sense of the national identity as Singaporean, as opposed to Chinese or Indian or Malays, and based on the distance to all the motherland of the Indian, Chinese, and Malay races, then there was a greater sense of developing, greater sense of ethnic consciousness. In fact, in the 80s, in order to bring the different racial categories together and promoting greater sense of intra-ethnic homogeneity, there was what we call the Speak Mandarin campaign. As we mentioned just now, the Chinese ground was very diverse, because you had people speaking different dialects. So Mandarin was really not used as often. And so he was very clever to promote speaking of Mandarin to unite all the Chinese groups, so that within the next 20 years, and also as part of this sense of bilingualism, where Mandarin was taught as a mother tongue in school, then you find a new generation emerging who can speak Mandarin, right? In the same way, the Indian community will use Tamil as a common language among themselves, even though there are 10 to 20 different Indian minority groups within themselves. And same thing with the Malay groups. The Malay group is not homogeneous either. There are Javanese, there are even Pakistani, there are different other groups within the Malay community. So we have actually just borrowed the British racial categorization of Chinese, Malay, and Indian for administrative purpose. So Peter is correct to see that in a lot of government, especially the British colonial masters, they were using all these racial categories as whole packages in order to be able to divide and rule and maintain social peace, using these racial categories. So when to use these to build a national identity, and when to downplay or when to kind of promote such ethnic consciousness is truly dependent on the times and the maturity of the society at that time. So I think in Singapore's situation, Lee Kuan Yew was a very keen student of culture and cultural communities. I don't know whether that helps.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. On behalf of Peter, I think thank you so much for addressing that question so thoughtfully. So I have a follow-up question. I think you articulated this phenomenon of a national identity within Singaporeans very well. I also observed that, by studying Singapore and visiting Singapore, that there isn't this harmful nationalism, although there is a very strong and healthy national identity. So my question for you, Lawrence, is as a citizen, as a scholar who does research on leadership. From a leadership perspective, how do you think leaders and government and social organizations can promote this sense of balance, this equilibrium between a healthy national identity and not, excessive nationalism?
Right. Thanks for the question. I think this is a very real existential challenge posed and faced by many societies and many leaders, even in businesses and companies. I think the context, especially in what we are calling globalization, this age of globalization, we just find that there's transnational migration and people are just flocking to the cities. And Singapore as a global city right now, I think there are estimates by sociologists that there are over 150 ethnicities, if not nationalities, within Singapore per se. So this is something that Singapore has always experienced. From 6 months after it became a trading post of the British, you find that there were a lot of immigrants coming to Singapore already. So as we mentioned, Singapore had already this ethnic demographics of Chinese majority, Malays, Indians, and many other ethnics within Singapore for over 150 years. So in modern Singapore, in post-independent Singapore, you find that in the initial years, we were also attracting foreign investment. And as the economy grows, we also recognize that there are a lot of gaps in our workforce, in our labor, that requires a lot more labor and what we call foreign talent, because you need global talents, you need innovation, and you need to therefore welcome people to come to your shores in order to be able to grow the economy and grow the technology and innovation. So Singapore went through these phases that although we are proud of our national identity, and we recognize that, however, there's a need to welcome immigrants, foreign workers, foreign talents, and new immigrants and new citizens to our shores. But how the government manages this continues to be a very delicate art, right? So a very practical example in Singapore, in the 2011 general elections, there was a huge swing against the PAP government. So the context is that Singapore government has enjoyed a one-party dominance for many years, right from the beginning. But in 2011, there was a huge swing against the ruling party, and this was read to be a protest vote against the ruling party because the government has allowed for a lot more new arrivals. The immigration policy needed to be tweaked. So there was a sense of xenophobia because, as you know, from the year 2000, there was also economic recession, and the 2008 global economic crisis was also a great impact on Singapore's economy. So locals who were losing their jobs will be scratching their heads and asking, here we are losing our jobs, why are we still allowing foreigners to come to our land, you see? So there was this sense of maybe you will wish xenophobia and anger. So the government subsequently needed to tweak its immigration policy. So there's always a delicate balance, how many and how to welcome immigrants and foreign talents and global talents to your shores to boost up your economy and to grow a vibrant economy and global city, recognizing we are a very small market at 6 million. So, but yet we are even a smaller place. You know, we are only 700 square kilometers. So we cannot have more people coming to live on this very small land area. So that is where the art of managing this social cohesion and economy has to come into play. Yeah, but we are thankful so far. I think there's a lot of wisdom in addressing this issue and how to create that balance where people will be comfortable.
Thank you, Lawrence. So you mentioned the delicate art of balance several times. You also mentioned that Lee Kuan Yew was a studious student of Asian cultures and values. I wonder to what extent you think the maybe Confucian value of moderation played a role in his leadership decisions.
Oh, thanks for asking this question, because I think it has been very widely acknowledged, even by world leaders, that Lee Kuan Yew, you know, is a Confucianist statesman and a Confucianist leader, which to some of the majority Chinese population of Singapore, we will be actually wondering, because as we mentioned, Lee Kuan Yew grew up in a Straits-born Chinese family background, which is what we call the Peranakan. So they are more Anglophile, they are more oriented to the British colonial masters at that time, and they had a culture of speaking more Malay language than Chinese. And that's why Lee Kuan Yew had to learn Chinese in his adult life, which he did all the way until his very old age, even in his retirement. Yeah. But you are right to say that he, however, being an astute student of cultures and also as a politician, he recognized in the early years in the 70s that besides using the language as a way, as a vehicle for mobilization, as you mentioned about Nelson Mandela, able to speak their heart language so that you can touch their hearts and win their support. But he also recognized the difference between Western values and Asian values, you see. And there was this anecdote where he was present at early infantry troops, gathering where, as the soldiers were helping the local village community to build a road in those days, in the 70s, the village chief, on behalf of the villagers, presented the military camp with a black and white television in those days. So they had two young soldiers to give speeches, right, to thank the village for that gift of the television set. And he noticed the different attitudes, because an English educated soldier said that, well, with the gift of the TV, we will have enjoyable nights in the camp. But the Chinese educated soldier spent time thanking the village for the opportunities to serve together and for their hospitality and that connections and the relationship. So he distinguished that there was a very stark difference between Western and more individualistic values system vis-a-vis the Chinese, which was more communitarian sense of value system. So and that's why in the 1980s, Lee Kuan Yew was very active in promoting not only speaking Mandarin to unite the Chinese community, but he was very strong in propounding Confucianism, as an ethos that would be able to kind of permeate the Chinese community because of that strong, as you mentioned, the moderation and, more importantly, the communitarian social values, with the emphasis on relationships and ethics.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Crystal has a question for you. Singapore is such a small dot, like you said, in the Malay Peninsula, and also described with an analogy as don't want to be another Israel among the Muslim countries. So what sacrifices did Singapore have to make in order to become its own country?
I think in terms of sacrifice, it's very important to recognize that we try, on the one hand, to play to our strengths, that in our nation we have population or comprising of Chinese, Malays, and Indians with strong ties to the cultural hinterland of China, India, and the Malay archipelago. But to become Singaporean as a strong sense of unique national identity, we would therefore have to kind of call for a very deliberate, intentional way of becoming distinctive from those in China, India, and the Malay archipelago in the region. A very simple example is that in our international relations, in our foreign policies, you find that two examples. Singapore was very much sought after in 1978 by China as a model for economic development, because if some of us who are initiated, you know that China's paramount leader at that time, Deng Xiaoping, visited Singapore in 1978 and formed a very good friendship with Lee Kuan Yew, and there told the governors of Guangdong and Fujian province that we must learn from Singapore, and Singapore became a benchmark for economic development. And in the process of building diplomatic relations, Singapore, however, declared that we will be the last country in ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, to form this diplomatic ties with China. And secondly, in the use of language, even in communicating with China, you find that all our leaders, including Lee Kuan Yew, who are conversant in Mandarin, will always speak in English and use a translator even in the process of communicating with the Chinese leadership, right? So this is an example of maybe a little small sacrifice where we would have to distance ourselves in terms of our national standing, to send forth a statement that we are a sovereign nation. We are not a second China, nor are we a second Israel, or we are not a third China, no, a second Israel. Yeah. So I think maybe that's just a little example. I don't know whether that helps in this question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I hope Crystal found it helpful as well. Since you mentioned the interaction and the friendship between Deng Xiaoping and Lee Kuan Yew, Lawrence, I was wondering, this is maybe a personal curiosity. So I assume Deng Xiaoping knew that Lee Kuan Yew spoke Mandarin fluently, but he purposefully used English as the medium of communication. I wonder how Deng Xiaoping reacted to that particular action.
Oh, I think the Chinese leaders always needed to be kind of prompted, to say that this is our deliberate posture, that to signal that we are an independent nation and we have our own sovereignty. So I think this is important, especially because we are a small nation. That's why earlier on, when I highlighted the example of the caning of the American youth, Michael Fay, it took the American President Clinton to intervene, on the behalf of the teenager. But unfortunately, we could not, change that punishment just because the American president had intervened. So we provided a little response by reducing, in terms of his plea for clemency, reducing the strokes from 6 strokes of the cane to 4. But we had to go ahead simply because we have to implement our Singapore laws in order to signal that we are a sovereign nation and that we cannot be cowed by any other nation, big or small. So I think this is important. So in terms of relations with China, I think they also had to take time to begin to appreciate that though they are proud of Singapore as a Chinese society with this economic success, but we are basically a Singapore country, a nation of our own. We are not a third China. Yeah. And in fact, we are not what we call Chinese subjects living overseas. We are not overseas Chinese in that sense. Yeah. But we are Singapore citizens in our own right.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lawrence. And in this lecture, you've shared such important insights, especially from a leadership perspective. I think all of us, if I can speak on behalf of the audience, as simultaneous leaders and followers in our respective organizations and communities, there are so many things that I think we have learned from your lecture, particularly the importance of cultural competency, compassion, humanity, being deliberate, and even there's an element of pragmatism that Lee Kuan Yew's leadership exemplified. So thank you so much, Lawrence, for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's Leading Edge Leadership Speaker Series. We appreciate your attendance very much. Have a good night.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence.